So the last part of today's lecture is about loops and branching statements. I just want to touch on the differences between C++ and Python and how you can use loops and branching statements in this language. You have seen several examples of loops in previous lectures. So hopefully this lecture will summarize what you have already learned and will highlight the differences between these statements in C++ and Python. So the first type of loops that we use in C++ is the for loop. A for loop has three parts: initialization expression, test expression, and the update expression. These three parts are usually enclosed in parentheses, and they are separated by semicolons. So the initialization expression just initializes the loop variable, in this case I. The test expression is checked or evaluated before each loop cycle. If the text expression is true, then you run the statements that you have in the block, in the loop block. If it evaluates to false, then you skip these statements and you run the other statements that you have after the for loop. And the update expression will update the value of the loop variable. In this case, we are incrementing I. So if you want to have multiple statements in the for loop, you need to add the curly braces to define a block. If you just want to have one expression, then you can eliminate these curly braces and just write one expression right after the for loop. That is the only expression that you run in every loop cycle. So you can also declare a variable inside the for loop. For example, here you can write int I equal to 0. So it declares that variable I and it initializes the variable. Note that if you declare a variable inside the for control section, then that variable can only be accessed in the control block, in the loop block, or in the block that follows the for loop. It cannot be seen or accessed outside this block. You can also use the comma operator in order to initialize multiple variables in the initialization expression, or update multiple variables in the update expression. The comma operator can be used in order to combine multiple expressions into one expression. So if you want to, let's say, initialize I and j at the same time, then you can write I equal to 0, comma, j is equal to 10, for example. And if you want to increment them, you can write increment I or plus plus I, comma, plus plus j. The next type of the for loop that we will use frequently when we work with data structures and containers is the range-based for loop. Range-based for loops are introduced in C++ 11, and they simplify running a certain number of operations on elements of a container. This container can be an array, it can be a vector, it can be a set, and so on and so forth. So the syntax is like this. You write a double, let's say you declare an array of doubles of size 3, double tips 3, then you initialize array elements. And now let's say that you want to print every element of that array. So what you do is that you say for every element in this array, which is of type double, I want to print this element. So X is now the element, one of the elements of this array, and you run this statement for every element that you see in this container. So this statement will run 3 times. First time you write, you print 5.99 to the standard output. Next time 7.49, 6.87, and the loop terminates. The while loop is another type of loop that we use in C++. It only has essentially the test expression and then the block that follows the loop. The test expression is checked before each loop cycle. if this is true, if this condition is met, then you run the statements that you have inside this block. If this condition is false, you simply skip the block and then run the other statements that follow the while loop. So the difference between the for loop and the while loop is that in the for loop you do not have in the while loop you do not have the initialization expression, and you do not have the update expression. You can still update I. You can, for example, increment I, but this has to be one of the statements that you write here. So while loop is often used when you do not know exactly how many times the loop will execute. If you know exactly how many times it will execute, then you can use the for loop. Now, another type of loop is the do while loop. It's very similar to the while loop. The only difference is that the test expression is evaluated after each loop cycle instead of evaluating it before each loop cycle, which happens in the while loop. So for that reason, it's called an exit condition loop. The while loop or the for loop is an entry condition loop. Now, lastly, we want to talk about the branching statements. The most important type of branching statements in C++ is the if-else statement. So they are used if you want to decide whether or not to run a particular statement or a set of statements that are enclosed in curly braces. So, for example, here I'm comparing a character that is word I with capital A. If it's greater than capital A, this is the logical AND that you see here, and it's less than capital Z, then I run these statements. If this condition is not met, then I move on to the else section. Now here I have else if, because I want to also test another condition, that is word I is equal to the null character. If it's equal to the null character, then I run these statements. And if this condition is not met, then I move on to the else part of the if-else statement, and I run these statements. Again, if you want to run more than one statement, you have to put these statements in a block, and the block is defined using curly braces. So the test condition is usually comprised using relational expressions and logical operators. So the relational expressions can be combined using logical operators. The logical operators are or, and not. And the relational expressions are expressions that in which you use relational operators like greater than, or equal, equal, not equal, and so on and so forth. And lastly, there is an operator, question mark colon, that can be used instead of an if-else statement. So this is just a short form of the if-else statement. What it does is that it evaluates expression 1. If expression 1 is true, then the result of this whole thing is expression 2. If expression 1 is not true, then the result is expression 3. So one example here is that you compare A and B. If A is greater than B, then the result of this expression or is A. If A is less than or equal to B, then it's B. And you can assign it to, let's say, an integer C.